like to introduce our speaker, Rene Gomez. He's senior librarian here at the library. He's worked for the library system, I believe, 13 years. So he's a Fort Worth native. He loves the history. He not only does research on these kinds of things, he also loves taking photos of historic landmarks and Fort Worth architecture. One of the things he does is upload those photos. I'm really just
yeah, I know.
You okay with that?
I'm fine.
One of the things he does is upload the photos that he takes on his personal time up to Wikipedia and provides research on those websites for that. So at this time, Rene, I'd like to bring you on up and let you get started. He's going to talk about the river bottoms and that side of life.
All right, thanks. Thank you, buddy. 1, 2, 3. Hi, good morning, everybody. Hi. Well, today I want to talk about a particular area during a particular time in Fort Worth history. I'm going to talk about the river bottoms area during the Victorian era, specifically the misfortunes and the bad stuff that happened in this part of Fort Worth. And I think anybody who has a kind of understanding about Fort Worth's past know that the city really has a kind of a remarkable and storied history. It's a kind of a history of a lot of brave characters, enterprising people, and some notorious individuals, which I'll get into. Yeah. Now, those who are not familiar with the Victorian era, this area was named after her, Queen Victoria. She ruled Great Britain from 1819 to 1901. Significant period in Great Britain's history. It was an area that was associated with advances in, of course, science, industry, and literature. But the Victorian era was also an important part in really Fort Worth's history, really economically and politically, because it was during this period when Fort Worth kind of evolved from a sleepy kind of military outpost to a major city in the state of Texas. And the city's development during that period was accompanied by kind of a lot of extraordinary and also, of course, some disturbing occurrences, specifically in the river bottoms areas, which I'll get into. Now, where is the river bottoms? What am I talking about? Well, here's a map of the area that I'm talking about. This map, of course, shows part of the Trinity River system. And the area that I'm going to concentrate on is actually this area right here. This is downtown Fort Worth. This is the Trinity River system. This is where the west and the Clear Fork of the Trinity River meet, right there. It's just north of where the current Tarrant County Courthouse is. It's also right next to the old power plant. So that area is where I'm going to be focusing on this morning. Now, to kind of give you a good idea about really the troubling history of the river bottoms, I think it's probably appropriate to kind of give you kind of a brief history about Fort Worth. Fort Worth did start out as an outpost against raids by Native Americans, and troopers from Company F of the 2nd Dragoons under command of this gentleman here, this is Ripley Arnold, he established a military post in 1849 over on a bluff overlooking the area where the Clear Fork and the West Fork of the Trinity River meet. The outpost was actually one of 8 facilities, of course, built to protect settlers from raids by Native Americans. In fact, Camp Worth was actually built to protect a couple of frontier settlements, Johnson Station, which is now known as Arlington, and Burville, which we now know better as Halton City. The encampment was named after this gentleman here. This is William J. Worth. General Worth was a veteran of the War of 1812. In fact, he was seriously injured in that war. He was an instructor at West Point. He was involved in the Seminole Campaign in Florida in 1842. Worth achieved his greatest distinction during the Mexican-American War. In 1847, he actually led the first amphibious landing of U.S. Army troops in that conflict. And after the war, he actually was considered a serious presidential candidate. Now, it was Worth actually had ordered Major Arnold to establish that line of garrisons that I mentioned earlier, and it's one of those garrisons that became Camp Worth. And I should point out that actually General Worth actually never visited Camp Worth, the one that's named after him. He did die of cholera in San Antonio in 1849 when he was only 55 years old. Now, the troops stationed in Camp Worth and other new Army posts, of course, were very effective in dealing with the Native American population there. And as the raids kind of died down, kind of more settlers kind of moved into the area. And in 1850, well, actually, with Native American rape camps, raids no longer a problem. The Army kind of felt that the facility kind of outlived its usefulness. So in 1853, the War Department ordered the facility closed. And by September of that year, that post was abandoned. Now, during the time that the post was operational, a population was establishing themselves kind of around the post. And they turned the cavalry stable into a hotel. The old commissary turned into a store, and other buildings were turned into churches and so on. So a lot of individuals arriving in Fort Worth at that time, some of these newcomers actually helped lay the foundation for the kind of development of Fort Worth. A few of them, or probably some of you probably recognize. John Peter Smith is one name you probably recognize. He's referred to as the father of Fort Worth. Our county hospital is named after him. Smith opened the first school in the Kansas Hospital in 1854, not long after it was abandoned. Romero Daggett, he's a Canadian, opened a general merchandise store in Fort Worth, started the city's first hotel. Became one of the biggest landowners in Fort Worth, actually. Also played a part in getting the Texas Pacific Railroad to extend its tracks to Fort Worth. Cleaver Miller Van Zandt, known as Mr. Fort Worth, opened a dry goods store in town. He founded the city's first newspaper, the Fort Worth Democrat. He was also involved in banking and land development. And Dr. Carroll Peak, he was the city's actually first doctor, and set up his practice actually in the abandoned Army House, and actually for years was actually the only doctor in the city of Fort Worth. He also opened the city's first drugstore. Now, in 1860, the city of Fort Worth became the county seat of Tarrant County. Now, there's a bizarre story I really like to mention about how Fort Worth achieved this distinction of becoming the county seat. The town of Birdville, actually, which is now in Halton City, actually won the first election to become the county seat in 1850. And the citizens of Fort Worth were, of course, not thrilled about this. So using a little political maneuvering, they actually forced a second election. Now, in order to encourage voter turnout in the second election, both sides started giving away whiskey to start to get people to the polls. And the story is that some people went to the Fort Worth side, went to the Birdville side, siphoned off their whiskey, and took it to Fort Worth. So, and of course, that increased their turnout on their side, and Fort Worth won that election. Of course, Birdville, of course, was not pleased about that, and one thing led to another, and next thing you know, you had this huge conflict between Birdville and Fort Worth. And actually, a few did turn quite violent. Actually, there were 3 deaths on there were several incidents which resulted in 3 people being killed. Well, in 1860, Texas legislators saw that the situation was not good. They stepped in, ordered a new election, and Fort Worth won that one, and officially became the county seat. Now, the latter part of the 19th century also saw the coming, really, of 2 industries that really had a major impact in the growth of Fort Worth. The first one, of course, was the railroad. It arrived in Fort Worth in July of 1876. This is the famous Texas Pacific Railroad. Now, another industry, of course, that had an impact, of course, was the cattle industry. And now, after the Civil War, there was, of course, a huge demand for beef in the cities, of course, of the East Coast of the United States. Cattle became really a sought-after commodity in Texas. And Texas, of course, began to drive cattle north to the markets, of course, of Missouri and Kansas. And Fort Worth was actually on the last stop on the Eastern Trail before, of course, connecting to the Chisholm Trail in Oklahoma. The trail, of course, pumped a lot of money into Texas, specifically in Fort Worth, which really needed the money because after the Civil War, the city was financially on its back, so it was in a pretty bad shape. But what made Fort Worth's position on the Eastern Trail kind of unique was that it was not only the place for cowboys to buy supplies, but it was also a place for them to kind of relax. To a cowboy, towns like Fort Worth was kind of like shore leave for a sailor. He had money in his pocket, go in there, and start spending it. I mean, a cowboy on the Chisholm Trail, on the trail, actually earned around like $30 a month. And what was a cowboy spending it on? Well, it was likely he was spending really in three places: a gambling establishment, a saloon, and a bordello. It was just three things. It was booze, gambling, and women. And it was not just cowboys coming to Fort Worth to partake in some of the city's, of course, dubious diversions. Of course, buffalo hunters, railroadmen also came to Fort Worth to take advantage of some of the city's amusements. Fort Worth was often referred to as the capital of whiskey, whoopee, and women. And this is where Hell's Halfacre, of course, comes into the story. The heart of Hell's Halfacre is actually this area right here, kind of around Calhoun, Rusk, Commerce, and 12th Street. Actually, the convention center is in that area right there. And this area offered a variety of saloons for about every taste. Many of these saloons were actually open around the clock. And all these diversions, of course, gave Fort Worth a reputation of being the wildest town in the West. And it didn't start with gambling, prostitution, and drinking. You had fights, you had murders, you had suicides, drug abuse, vagrancies, muggings. Stagecoaches were often robbed by hoods who hung out at Hell's Halfacre. And but what made the area notable was that it attracted some legendary folks, people like Wyatt Earp, famous train robber Sam Bass, Doc Holliday, Luke Short, and of course Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. This gave Fort Worth the designation as the Paris of the Plains. So now by 1876, the state of affairs in Hell's Halfacre, of course, continued to get really, really bad. In fact, it got so bad a special reform government was actually elected to deal with that situation. The city passed several ordinances. Gambling became severely restricted. Saloons and beer halls were forced to close on Sundays. The city's anti-gun law was enforced, so they figured, hey, problem solved. But because of new regulations, the visitors to Fort Worth were not generous in spending their money in the city and took their business someplace else. So the business community and the city fathers were not happy about that situation. I mean, sure, there was a lot of vile things going on in Hell's Halfacre, but hey, they were spending money in the city. So they managed to get the government to, city government to suspend the ordinances, and now we're back to square one. And all the tomfoolery, once again, was giving Fort Worth another bad reputation. So that spurred the citizens to say kind of enough is enough. So in 1876, the citizens of Fort Worth elected this guy right here. This is Timothy Courtwright as marshal. They figured this is the guy who can probably bring some civility to this town. Mr. Courtwright is a kind of interesting character. He's a native of Illinois, possessor of a fast draw and owner of 2 6-shooters. And he was also a Civil War veteran who was injured in the Battle of Belmont. Courtwright was kind of put in a delicate situation here because as marshal he was supposed to uphold the law, but the business community didn't want Mr. Courtwright to go too far in dealing with the individuals who, of course, came and patronized all the saloons and the gambling halls and the bordellos for a very simple reason. Of course, they spent money here. Hell's Halfacre provided actually a good portion of the city's revenue. So Courtwright's mission was really not to clean up the town, but make sure that the shenanigans didn't go too far. Courtwright kind of took a laissez-faire approach to these rowdy folks. The only time Courtwright would arrest somebody he would arrest somebody for intoxication is after the individual had spent all his money. When he spent all his money, now you got the cuffs on you. So, but the issue with Courtwright was not so much his laid-back approach to the job, but his conduct, because in the span of 4 years, he was charged with serious criminal behavior 4 times. And probably the most well-known incident involved Courtwright shooting a man who had the gall to place an advertisement on the paper, accusing him of protecting gambling interests, which was probably true. But Mr. Courtwright saw that as an affront, and he actually shot the guy on Main Street in broad daylight. But he managed to get acquitted. And on top of that, Mr. Courtwright liked to gamble himself in the same places that, of course, he was opposed to police. And yet, despite all his legal troubles, he was re-elected twice. Now, by 1878, the situation in Hell's Halfacre was really becoming really unbearable, because in that same year, an attorney named R.A. Beckham ran for mayor on the slate to clean up Hell's Halfacre, and he won the election. And the next year, the citizens of Fort Worth got fed up with Mr. Courtwright, and elected somebody else as marshal. As Mr. Courtwright, he was gunned down in 1887 in a famous, of course, gun battle with Luke Short that has been billed as the last great gunfight. So now, a lot of what was going on in Hell's Halfacre, of course, did not stay in Hell's Halfacre. Some of that bad karma kind of went into the River Bottoms area. This is a drawing of what Fort Worth probably looked like in the late 19th century. This is the old Tarrant County Courthouse, not our current one, but the previous one built right there. And here's part of the Trinity River system right here. And this is where, of course, once again, I mentioned this is where the Clear Fork and the West Fork kind of meet right there. And so this is the area that I'm going to be talking about right here. This is the River Bottoms area right there. Now, I've come across a good number of articles from various local papers written during the late 19th and early 20th century to kind of show you what was going on in that area. Here's an article from the Dallas Morning News in 1887. This article states that the police were concerned about a class of people not desirable. The article states that the river bottom near the city was filled with these characters at night who go there to sleep during the day, and they can be found hanging around the dyes of Hell's Halfacre. So the River Bottoms area kind of became a place where a lot of individuals, after a night of heavy drinking at Hell's Halfacre, would go to the River Bottoms area and kind of sleep it off. And of course, wake up the next morning, go back to Hell's Halfacre, have their fun, and well, I think you know where this is going. So. This is an article from the Fort Worth Register in also 1897. This is about an individual named Tom D. And the story, according to the article, the story is that Mr. D was on the Trinity River Bottoms area, and the boys found him dead under a cottonwood tree. And the only items he had on him when he was found was that he had a handkerchief and a hat, and that was it. And now, according to the article here, Mr. D, who was known as Old Uncle Tom, he was a 75-year-old Englishman who worked as a dishwasher in Fort Worth. And he had been known around Fort Worth for about a few years. And the article states that Mr. D was originally a landowner from Iowa who experienced family troubles. It didn't say what they meant by that, but he had family troubles. And but in any case, he had some issues. And for reasons I haven't been able to find out, he left Iowa and came to Fort Worth. Now, I managed to find some additional information about Mr. D here. He's originally actually from Durham, England. He was actually born in Durham, England in 1830. And he and his wife, Margaret, took a boat from Liverpool and ended up in New York and settled in Iowa in 1866. And then, of course, later Mr. D came to Fort Worth. The article states that Mr. D was given to periodical sprees and was a great sufferer of neuralgia, which is some kind of a neurological disorder. So he was going through some health issues, and the story was that he borrowed 50 cents from his employer to buy medicine. Took the medicine, went to the River Bottoms area, and he expired, and that was it. Here's another article. Another sad case, also has connections to the River Bottoms area. This was on the Fort Worth Register in 1901. And this involves a gentleman named John Tellman. That's that gentleman right there. I got the red circle right there. Story was that he's originally from Jasper, Iowa. Story is that Mr. Tellman went to Southern California. He was a drifter, went to Southern California, and then came to Fort Worth. He was riding freight trains to Fort Worth. Now, the article states that Mr. Tellman was, who was 25 years old at the time, he was bathing in the river bottoms there, in the Trinity River, and somebody walked up and just stabbed him in the groin. He did not get any medical attention, and he died of tetanus. Now, this is where the story gets a little strange, because he refused to tell the authorities who stabbed him. Totally didn't want to cooperate with them. And another kind of weird thing about the story was that he was panhandling around the city of Fort Worth, despite the fact he had $500 in the bank account. The story gets a little stranger because his father, George Tellman, this gentleman here, was actually a very prosperous landowner from Grinnell, Iowa. Now, why did he decide he wanted to leave that farm and become a drifter and come to Fort Worth, I don't know. But in any case, Mr. Tellman here, his father, was notified about his son's death. and came to Fort Worth and got his son's remains and returned the remains back to Grinnell, Iowa. Murder was not the only, of course, tragic events that happened in the River Bottoms area. This incident was reported in the Telegram in 1905. A 16-year-old named Archie Holloman was swimming around the Trinity River area, around the River Bottoms area, and he drowned. And another individual named Leo McDade went over to the River Bottoms area and tried to rescue that gentleman, but he also drowned, and none of the bodies were ever recovered. This is another sad case. This is in 1902. This was also in the Fort Worth Telegram. According to the article here, a gentleman named Hendricks Long was found cut, stabbed, beaten, and choked. And what happened was that after he was murdered, somebody took his body and dumped it in the River Bottoms area, not far from the county jail. Well, the article states that his body was in the water for about several days before it was spotted. But 2 men were arrested. One of them was a gentleman named Andrew Cruz, and he was tried and sentenced to life in prison. But the other person accused of Mr. Long's murder was this gentleman right here. This is Joe Wolf right there. And interesting enough, at the same time that he was in big trouble for Mr. Hendricks' Long murder, he was actually also charged with murdering somebody else. So this guy apparently has some serious issues here. In any case, he was tried for Mr. Long's murder, but he was acquitted, believe it or not. Another case with connections to River Bottoms area. This was also in the Fort Worth Telegram in 1904. A kid named Lloyd Parker found some skeletal remains actually in some tall weeds not far from the River Bottoms area. The authorities determined that the remains were of a John Parker. And turns out Mr. Parker was actually murdered. And turns out Mr. Parker, before he was murdered, he was actually living in a log cabin made of strips of sheet iron in the River Bottoms area. And he was about 70 years old, and he was a guy that really didn't have contact with a lot of people, so he was kind of a bit of a hermit. But in any case, someone was arrested for Mr. Parker's murder, and it was actually put on trial. Now, I went to the Tarrant County Courthouse to look at some old records to find out what happened to the gentleman who was accused of murdering Mr. Parker, but I haven't found anything, so I don't know what happened. I don't know if he was acquitted or he was found guilty. Now, there was also some numerous cases where individuals met an untimely end in the River Bottoms area. Here's an account. It was reported in the Morning Register in 1900. It involved a 50-year-old former slave named Rush Lloyd. He and his father actually had gone to the River Bottoms area to fish. Now, the story was that Mr. Lloyd was an epileptic. And what Lloyd would do when he went out to fish in the River Bottoms area is that he would actually tie himself to a tree so that in case if he had a seizure, he wouldn't fall into the river. Well, what happened was that, in this case, was that Mr. Lloyd was in the process of tying himself to a tree. He had a seizure, and he fell in the river and drowned, unfortunately. Here's another sad case. Morning Register, 1900. A woman named Kitty Ray was found dead in a shack next to the river. The story was that a woman named Maddie Roberts was just passing around and just found Ray barely clinging to life. So she notified the authorities, but unfortunately, by the time anybody showed up, she had already passed. Here's another sad case right here. This was also reported in the Telegram, 1904. An African-American woman named Annie Barton was living in some kind of shack on Yellow Road number 16, not too far from here. And she just dropped dead all of a sudden. Just dropped dead. Nobody knows why, but she just dropped dead. Now, the River Bottoms also became a place where people would discard human remains. Here's a kind of a disturbing incident that happened in 1890. It was reported in the Morning News where somebody put a stillborn baby in a shoebox and put it in the River Bottoms under a bridge. Yeah. 2 dead infants were also found in the River Bottoms area. This was in the Dallas Morning News in 1890. Here's another disturbing case. Also in the Morning Register in 1900. A bunch of fishermen were strolling along the River Bottoms area and came across a little small cave. And the fishermen decided to check out this cave. And when they were in there, they found some skeletal remains that was next to a kettle and a tomahawk, interesting enough. Now, the river bottoms also turned out to be a place where criminals would try to hide from the law. There's a story that happened in 1902. An 8-year-old boy named Roy Muffet was playing with his toy rifle, and he was shooting some tin cans. Well, a 7-year-old boy named Johnny Putman was kind of wandering around the area, and apparently wasn't paying too much attention to what was going on because one of those bullets hit him in the head. Well, Mr. Moffett saw what happened, and he panicked, and he made a break for it, and he went to the river bottoms area thinking, nobody was going to catch him. As for Putnam, the article stated that the physicians didn't have any hope for his recovery, but nothing more was written about the case, so I didn't know what happened to Mr. Putnam. This appeared in the Fort Worth Telegram in 1904. A woman named Ludy Thoreau had just left work at the Swift packing plant and was on her way home. And the story was that she was walking on Samuels Avenue. This is Samuels Avenue right here. It was going right past Pioneer Rest Cemetery over here, when a gentleman came up and started making indecent comments to her and then decided to attack her. Well, this individual obviously picked the wrong woman because this woman put up a fight. And he decided that decided to give up, and he made a break for it. And where did he go? He decided to go to the river bottoms area and hide out there. And he escaped and was never captured. Here's another incident. It's about an individual who ran a smokehouse and was a victim of a burglary. Somebody went into his smokehouse and stole his hams. Turns out these 4 individuals broke into an individual smokehouse, stole his hams, and were reselling them. The 4 men were arrested and were taken to the sheriff's office, but during the investigation, one of the men, named J.W. Parker, made a break for it. He made a break for it, and where did he go? He went to the river bottoms area to hide out. A couple of sheriff's deputies did give chase, but he was apprehended. Here's another case right here. This is about an Hispanic male named Rafuco Kreutzer, and he broke into a farmhouse, but a couple of farmhands apprehended him, and they put him on a horse with the intention of taking him to the authorities. Well, there was an altercation, and a gun was fired, and Mr. Kreutzer was hit. Well, the farmhands thought that they had killed him, so they took him back to the farm, but turns out he wasn't killed, and Mr. Kreutzer decided to make a break for it, and he went to the river bottoms area, but he was later captured by the sheriff's department. This was in the Fort Worth Telegram, 1905. A guy named Nolan Ferrell was arrested for stealing $50, tried to make a break for it, and he jumped into the Trinity River. He goes underwater with the idea if he stayed water long enough, nobody was going to catch him. Well, that didn't work because he was later apprehended. This incident reported in the Fort Worth Gazette in 1891. 3 African Americans went into a clothing store on Elm Street, and one of them engaged in a conversation with a clerk while the other man stole about 4 pairs of pants and decided to take off. Well, somebody in the store found this out, notified the police. The police officer spotted the 2 men, and the 2 men made a break for it. They threw the pants into somebody's house and went into the river bottoms area. They did catch the men. They did not catch the men, but the pants were recovered, by the way. Attempted suicides was also a problem in the river bottoms area. According to this article, a gentleman named Patsy Donald tried to jump over the railing of a bridge that spanned the Trinity River. And this happened, like I said, in 1902. He didn't have much luck because every time he tried to mount the railing, he fell back into the floor of the bridge. So a patrolman caught him and took him to jail. Here's another case where somebody left a note indicating that he or she intended to commit suicide. And this was reported in the Fort Worth Register in 1900. And the note was found on a bridge that was over the Trinity River area. And someone wrote the note saying that he or she intended to commit suicide. But according to the article, there was no evidence in anybody as suicide was ever carried out. Now, death and vagrancy, of course, was not the only issue affecting the river bottoms area. Flooding was really a huge issue around the Trinity. In fact, the problem with flooding actually goes as far back as the year Camp Worth was founded. Actually, a camp surgeon named J.M. Stadford actually sent a report to Washington referring to the floods and droughts caused by excessive changes in the river. That's a quote. In fact, Arnold's 2nd Dragoons, when they arrived at Camp Worth, they were actually warned about two dangers. The first one was raised by Native Americans, but the second danger was flooding. Well, they managed to take care of the Native Americans. The flooding, not so much. There were major floods in, of course, 1844, 1866, 1871, and 1890. And that has led to several incidents of drowning. In fact, here's this article right here in the Telegram 1905 here, where several incidents, individuals were living in flats along the river. And the article states that the officer was giving these residents a notice to move out or be swept up by the river. And it became such an issue that in 1905, the Telegram also ran an article that there had been several deaths in drowning in the Trinity River right here. The article advises parents to show restraint in permitting their kids to swim in the river. Now the question is that what is it about this area that made it such a magnet for misfortune and hardship? Well, some of the incidents can be attributed to the fact that this is a part of Fort Worth that's very, very quite poor. A lot of individuals living there were a lot of individuals living in substandard housing. They were barely eking out a living, and some of these neighborhoods, a good example is this place here. This is Batter Cape Flats here. But the residents in areas like the River Bottoms were regarded as kind of a lawless subculture, because a lot of these neighborhoods were not only divided by class, but also by race and ethnicity. Because you have to understand that at the time, the police department and the sheriff's department was pretty much mostly Anglo. The only African American on the force during the latter part of the 19th century was a gentleman named Hager Tucker. He only patrolled only the African American neighborhoods. In fact, the police department didn't hire another African American police officer actually until 1950. Law enforcement rarely policed these areas because if something happened in any of these areas, law enforcement kind of let residents take care of their own problems. So that would explain why anyone would, like for example, wanted to, of course, deposit a body in the area or, of course, escape from the law. So what became of the River Bottoms area? Well, by the turn of the century, a lot of neighborhoods were developed in these areas. These neighborhoods were kind of really like shanty towns, where the housing was substandard with no electricity or running water. A good example of a neighborhood in the River Bottoms area is this area called Little Mexico. It's this little yellow area right here. As you can see, this area kind of occupies like several blocks. This neighborhood was actually considered probably the worst neighborhood in Fort Worth. It became really kind of a haven for drug pushers and, of course, some bootleggers. Well, the neighborhood was actually finally raised in the 1940s when they decided to build the Ripley Arnold housing, complex. Of course, we all know the Ripley Arnold housing complex was finally torn down and is now occupied by Tarrant County College. And another neighborhood that developed close to the River Bottoms area was this area called Chambers Hill. This was a predominantly African-American community located just east of downtown Fort Worth. It's just west of the West Fork of the Trinity River here. And like Little Mexico, a lot of houses, dilapidated houses without running water, and also serious problem with prostitution. And was actually considered, once again, one of the worst neighborhoods in Fort Worth. Well, in the late 1930s, the city of Fort Worth actually tore down all those houses and built the Butler Housing Project, which is still there. So what does it look like today? Well, here's some photos I took of the River Bottoms area. As I mentioned earlier, flooding was a huge issue for the River Bottoms area. It actually took major floods in 1905 and 1908 to really convince the city to kind of do something about this problem. In 1910, the city did build a system of levees, but unfortunately those levees were no match for another major flood in 1922, where in that case over 3,000 acres were covered with water. And then there was another one in 1949 that caused $15 million in damage. The Trinity River's present levee system was actually built in the 1950s, and since then flooding has really not been a big problem. But another big difference in the river bottoms is that the area's been pretty much cleaned up, as you can see here. In the past, river bottoms became synonymous, of course, with dilapidated housing, of course, dead bodies, people escaping from the law. But today you have, of course, you have bike trails like this, you have parks. Tarrant County College built their campus there. You have some upscale housing, especially around Samuels Avenue there. So in about a little over 100 years, the river bottoms area really has gone through kind of a bit of a renaissance, so it looks great. So anyway, that's it. Man.